The B-17 Flying Fortress screamed toward the English countryside at 200 miles per hour, black smoke pouring from its No. 3 engine. Inside, 19-year-old tail gunner Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez pressed himself against the fuselage as flames licked at the aircraft's aluminum skin. The bomber had been hit by flak over Bremen, and now hydraulic fluid was feeding the fire like gasoline on a campfire. "We're gonna burn alive in here!" shouted the waist gunner over the roar of wind and flame. This was the nightmare scenario that haunted every B-17 crew member in 1943. Not getting shot down, that was quick. But burning alive trapped inside an aluminum coffin 30,000 feet above Germany, watching helplessly as fire consumed the aircraft around you. It was happening with terrifying frequency. In the first 8 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 188 B-17s to in-flight fires, not from direct hits that destroyed the aircraft instantly, but from small fires that started manageable and became unstoppable infernos. Hydraulic lines, electrical systems, fuel vapors. The Flying Fortress was filled with things that could burn, and once fire started spreading, crews had minutes before the aircraft became uninhabitable. The statistics were brutal. Of bombers that caught fire in flight, only 31% made it back to base. The rest either exploded, crashed, or forced crews to bail out over enemy territory. Each burning bomber represented 10 highly trained crew members, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators. Men who took months to train and were desperately needed as America ramped up its strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. Air Force commanders were desperate for solutions. They tried fireproof materials, better extinguisher systems, modified fuel lines. Nothing worked consistently. The fires were too fast, too aggressive, too unpredictable. Engineering teams had declared the problem unsolvable within acceptable weight and complexity parameters. But sometimes the most elegant solutions come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes the person who saves lives isn't an engineer or a general or a scientist. Sometimes it's just a guy who knows how to keep things from burning. The tactical situation was a nightmare that had stumped every senior officer in the sector. The Germans held the Siegfried Line extension, a series of interconnected bunkers, trenches, and observation posts built into hillsides that overlooked every approach. Any American movement during daylight hours was immediately spotted and targeted. Night attacks failed because the Germans had perfected their defensive coordination, using interlocking fields of fire and predetermined artillery strikes. Colonel Harrison had already lost 200 men trying conventional assaults. The first attack, a frontal assault at dawn, lasted exactly 14 minutes before German machine guns and mortars forced a retreat. The second attempt, a night infiltration, ended when German flares illuminated the advancing Americans, turning them into easy targets. The third try involved a diversionary attack on the left flank, while the main force hit the center. The Germans weren't fooled. They'd been fighting this war for 5 years and recognized every trick in the American playbook. The problem wasn't just the German positions, it was intelligence. The Wehrmacht knew exactly how many Americans faced them, where they were positioned, and what their capabilities were. German observation posts tracked every movement. Their snipers had mapped every foxhole, every supply route, every possible avenue of approach. The Americans had no secrets from an enemy that could see everything they did. "We're fighting with our pants down," Captain Rogers told his company commanders during a grim briefing in the basement of a bombed-out farmhouse. "They know our strength, our positions, our intentions. We can't surprise them because they're watching us around the clock." What made it worse was that intelligence suggested the Germans were planning their own offensive. Fresh troops had been observed moving into the sector. Artillery was being repositioned. The Americans weren't just failing to advance, they were about to be attacked by a force that knew their every weakness. Previous attempts at deception had failed spectacularly. Dummy positions built to confuse German observers were spotted immediately. Radio deception failed because German intelligence units monitored American communications and quickly identified false signals. Even attempts to move troops at night were detected by German listening posts equipped with sensitive acoustic equipment. The Americans were trapped in a tactical box, too weak to attack successfully, too exposed to defend comfortably, too visible to maneuver effectively. Every option had been tried. Every conventional solution had failed. The German defensive system was simply too sophisticated, too well-positioned, and too thoroughly planned to overcome with standard military tactics. That's when Jack Mendelsohn approached Sergeant Morrison with his idea about acoustic deception. Morrison's first response was predictable. "Soldier, we're fighting a war here, not putting on a goddamn concert." But Jack persisted, explaining how sound could be manipulated, how the enemy's own acoustic intelligence could be turned against them. Morrison listened, growing more skeptical by the minute. The kid was talking about using music theory to fool the Wehrmacht. It sounded like shell shock, like a mind that had cracked under pressure and retreated into fantasy. Jack Mendelsohn was 22 years old and looked even younger. Standing 5'7" with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly fogged in the cold, he was the last person anyone would expect to revolutionize warfare. Before Pearl Harbor, his biggest worry had been perfecting his senior composition thesis at Juilliard, a complex piece exploring how environmental acoustics affected musical perception. The war had interrupted everything. One day he was analyzing the acoustic properties of concert halls. The next, he was on a troop transport to Europe with a rifle he barely knew how to use. His fellow soldiers found him odd, the guy who hummed while cleaning his weapon, who could identify aircraft by engine sound alone, who spent his free time sketching acoustic diagrams in the margins of his field manual. "Mendelssohn's got music for brains," Private Torres would joke. "Ask him about Mozart. He'll talk your ear off. Ask him about killing Germans. He goes quiet." It wasn't that Jack was a coward. He'd performed adequately in the minor skirmishes the 99th had faced, but he approached warfare like a puzzle to be solved rather than an enemy to be destroyed. That analytical mindset led to his breakthrough observation. During his third week on the line, Jack noticed something nobody else had. The Germans were using their own acoustic intelligence against the Americans. German listening posts could identify American units by the sounds they made. Different weapons had different acoustic signatures, different vehicles produced different engine notes, even different accents and languages revealed unit compositions. "They're listening to us the same way I listen to an orchestra," Jack explained to Morrison during their first conversation about acoustic deception. "But they can tell if we're reinforced by the number of mess kits clanking during chow time. They know when we're preparing an attack because our weapons cleaning sounds different, more intense, more frequent. Sound is intelligence, Sergeant, and if they're using it against us, we can use it against them." Morrison's response was swift and brutal. "Mendelssohn, I don't know what kind of fancy college boy thinking got into your head, but this is war, real war. People die here. We don't have time for your musical theories." The rejection stung, but Jack persisted. He started documenting German acoustic patterns, when their sentries changed, how their patrol sounds differed from their routine activities, the way their artillery spotters communicated with their gun positions. He mapped the acoustic signature of their defensive system with the same precision he'd once applied to analyzing symphonies. Captain Rogers' reaction was even harsher when Morrison reluctantly brought Jack's ideas to his attention. "And this is what happens when we draft college boys," Rogers said dismissively. "What they think war is some kind of intellectual exercise. Tell your soldier to focus on his rifle and leave the tactics to people who understand combat." The formal rejection came in writing. Private Mendelssohn's suggestions regarding acoustic manipulation are noted but deemed impractical for current operational requirements. Soldier will return to standard duties and discontinue pursuit of unauthorized tactical innovations. But Jack couldn't let it go. Every night, As he listened to the German positions, he heard opportunities, patterns that could be exploited, acoustic vulnerabilities that could be targeted. The solution was there, hidden in plain sound, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to recognize it. The breakthrough would come, but first, Jack had to convince someone, anyone, to listen. Jack's real breakthrough came during a German artillery barrage on December 8th. Huddled in his foxhole, as shells screamed overhead, he noticed something extraordinary. The incoming rounds created a complex acoustic pattern that revealed the German artillery positions with mathematical precision. Each gun had a distinct acoustic signature, not just the sound of firing, but the way that sound bounced off terrain features and reached American ears. More importantly, he realized the Germans were using the same principles in reverse. They were listening to American artillery responses to triangulate Allied positions. It was acoustic chess, played with deadly precision by both sides, but the Germans were winning because they understood the game better. That night, Jack began developing what he privately called the audio deception protocol. The concept was elegantly simple. If the Germans were using sound to gather intelligence, then false sounds could feed them false intelligence. But it had to be sophisticated. Random noise wouldn't fool experienced German listeners. The deception had to follow patterns that seemed tactically logical while leading German intelligence to incorrect conclusions. Jack started with basic experiments, using mess kits, entrenching tools, and other standard equipment. He created acoustic signatures that mimicked different unit activities. Clanking metal in specific rhythms could simulate tank track maintenance. Coordinated footsteps could suggest troop movement. Tool sounds could indicate engineering preparations. The key insight came from his musical training, orchestration. Just as a composer carefully arranged instruments to create specific emotional effects, Jack could arrange battlefield sounds to create specific tactical illusions. The Germans weren't just listening for individual sounds, they were interpreting acoustic compositions that told tactical stories. Private Torres became Jack's first unwitting test subject. During routine foxhole maintenance, Jack convinced Torres to follow specific patterns while digging, rhythmic shovel work that would suggest preparation for a machine gun emplacement. Within 6 hours, German artillery began targeting that position with suppressing fire, confirming they were monitoring and interpreting American acoustic activity. The implications were staggering. If Jack could make the Germans think machine gun positions were being prepared where none existed, he could draw their fire away from real positions. If he could simulate tank movement, he could convince them armor was massing for attack. If he could orchestrate fake engineering sounds, he could make them believe Americans were tunneling or building fortifications that didn't exist. But the protocol required precise timing, multiple participants, and equipment the Army hadn't issued for acoustic deception. Jack needed megaphones, specific musical instruments, recording devices, and coordination tools that didn't exist in standard infantry supply chains. Most critically, he needed official authorization to test his theories under combat conditions. His first formal proposal was 8 pages of detailed acoustic analysis, including hand-drawn diagrams showing sound propagation patterns, mathematical calculations of decibel levels and frequency ranges, and tactical scenarios where audio deception could create operational advantages. He submitted it through proper channels, Morrison to Rogers to Colonel Harrison. The response arrived 3 days later. Private Mendelssohn's acoustic theories are noted but considered too experimental for current combat operation. Request denied. Soldier will return to standard infantry duties, but Jack had already begun informal testing. During off-duty hours, he practiced acoustic manipulation techniques with volunteers from his squad, using simple equipment, tin cups, wooden sticks, metal tools. He demonstrated how coordinated sounds could create convincing illusions of tactical activity. The results were promising enough to catch the attention of Lieutenant Walsh, a young officer who'd studied engineering before the war. Walsh understood the scientific principles Jack was describing and recognized their potential military applications. "This isn't music theory," Walsh told Morrison after observing one of Jack's demonstrations. "This is applied physics, and if it works, it could save lives." That endorsement opened the first crack in official resistance. Not approval yet, but curiosity. The beginning of institutional interest in Jack's crazy idea. Lieutenant Walsh convinced Captain Rogers to authorize a limited test on December 14th. The conditions were strict. Jack would have one night, minimal resources, and absolutely no interference with regular combat operation. If his acoustic deception failed or compromised American positions, he'd face court-martial for endangering troops. Jack's first attempt was a disaster. Working with 4 volunteers, he tried to simulate a platoon-sized movement in Sector 7, an area the Americans had abandoned 2 days earlier. The plan was elegant. Coordinated footsteps, equipment sounds, and whispered commands would convince German listeners that Americans were repositioning for a flanking attack. Everything went wrong. Private Davis tripped over barbed wire, creating a metallic crash that sounded nothing like tactical movement. Private Johnson's timing was off. His equipment clanking came 3 seconds late, destroying the illusion of coordinated troops. Worst of all, Jack miscalculated the acoustic properties of the terrain. The sounds that seemed convincing from American positions sounded obviously fake when heard from German observation posts. German snipers opened fire on Sector 7 within minutes, but their shots were poorly aimed and half-hearted. They detected American presence but weren't convinced of its tactical significance. The test had failed to achieve deception and had nearly gotten Jack's volunteers killed. "This is exactly what I expected," Captain Rogers told Jack the next morning. "You're playing games with people's lives, dear soldier. One more failure like that, and you're looking at serious disciplinary action." But Jack learned from the failure. The problem wasn't the concept, it was execution and acoustic engineering. Real deception required understanding how sound behaved in specific terrain under specific weather conditions. He'd been thinking like a musician when he needed to think like an acoustical engineer. The second test came 5 days later after Jack spent every off-duty hour studying the battlefield's acoustic properties. This time, he focused on a simpler objective, making the Germans think Americans were digging defensive positions in an area where none existed. Jack positioned his volunteers at calculated distances, using the natural acoustics of a small ravine to amplify and direct their sounds toward German positions. Instead of random digging, they followed precise patterns, rhythmic toolwork that suggested organized engineering, coordinated enough to sound professional but containing subtle irregularities that made it seem authentic. This test succeeded partially. German artillery began ranging shots on the fake positions within 2 hours, proving they detected and believed the deception. But the success created an unexpected problem. German observers increased surveillance of the area, making it harder for Americans to move through that sector without detection. "You fooled them," Lieutenant Walsh observed, "but you also created a tactical complication we didn't anticipate. The Germans are now watching that ravine constantly." The third test was Jack's most ambitious, simulating tank movements to convince Germans that American armor was massing for attack. Using metal tools scraped against rock, coordinated in patterns that mimicked tank track sounds, his team created acoustic signatures of armored vehicles that didn't exist. This attempt failed spectacularly. Experienced German tank hunters immediately recognized the sounds as fake, too regular, too perfect, lacking the mechanical complexity of real armored vehicles. Worse, the deception was so obviously artificial that it alerted Germans to American acoustic deception capabilities. German countermeasures began immediately. Enemy listening posts started broadcasting random noise to mask their own activities. German patrols began using acoustic camouflage, moving more quietly and unpredictably. The element of surprise that made Jack's concept viable was disappearing rapidly. And they're adapting faster than we're innovating, Morrison warned Jack. Every test teaches them as much as it teaches us. Pretty soon, they'll be immune to this whole approach. The pressure was mounting. Jack had demonstrated that acoustic deception was possible, but his methods were too crude and his understanding too incomplete. He needed better equipment, more sophisticated techniques, and deeper knowledge of German listening capabilities. Most critically, he needed to develop countermeasures for German countermeasures. Time was running out. Intelligence reports suggested German offensive preparations were accelerating. If Jack couldn't perfect his acoustic deception soon, the opportunity would be lost forever. Word of Jack's experiments reached division headquarters on December 20th, triggering a bureaucratic firestorm. Colonel Harrison received a formal inquiry from General Bradley's staff questioning why unauthorized acoustic experiments were being conducted in an active combat zone. Someone had reported the tests as a breach of operational security. The investigation was swift and harsh. Major Thompson from Division Intelligence arrived at the front lines with orders to assess and terminate any irregular activities that might compromise tactical security. His first meeting with Jack was hostile from the opening question. Private, do you understand that your amateur theatrics might have revealed our positions to enemy intelligence? Jack tried to explain the scientific principles, but Thompson cut him off. I don't care about your college theories. Soldier, I care about German observers who are now watching sectors they previously ignored because you've been making noise in the woods. Your little music experiments have created security vulnerabilities. The evidence seemed damning. German surveillance had indeed increased in areas where Jack conducted tests. Enemy patrols were probing more aggressively. Artillery strikes were more accurately targeted. From Division's perspective, acoustic deception had backfired catastrophically by drawing unwanted German attention to American activities. Captain Rogers, already skeptical, became openly hostile. I told you this was foolishness, he said, during a heated company meeting. Now Division thinks we're running a circus instead of fighting a war. Mendelssohn's musical fantasies have put this entire unit under scrutiny. The criticism went beyond Jack's immediate chain of command. Other units in the sector began complaining that acoustic experiments were disrupting established operational patterns. Neighboring companies reported that German behavior had become more unpredictable since the tests began. Artillery spotters claimed their targeting data was being compromised by acoustic interference. Lieutenant Walsh, Jack's only remaining supporter, found himself under pressure to distance himself from the project. I still think the concept has merit, he told Jack privately, but the political cost is getting too high. Division wants someone to blame for recent tactical complications, and you're the obvious target. The administrative response was designed to kill the project through bureaucracy. New regulations required all experimental activities to be approved by Division Intelligence, Brigade Operations, and Core Research, a process that would take weeks and required documentation that Jack couldn't provide. Any deviation from standard operating procedures needed written authorization from 3 separate commands. More damaging was the informal pressure. Senior NCOs began questioning Jack's loyalty and competence. College boy thinks he's smarter than the whole army, Sergeant Mitchell told anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Germans are shooting at us more accurately because he's been banging pots and pans in no man's land. The accusations weren't entirely unfair. Jack's tests had created complications. German defensive behavior had changed, making American operations more difficult. Intelligence patterns had shifted in ways that benefited the enemy. From a purely tactical perspective, acoustic deception appeared to be causing more problems than it solved. But Jack knew the real issue was timing and sophistication. His early tests were crude because he lacked proper equipment and institutional support. The failures were predictable given the limitations he was working under. With better resources and official backing, acoustic deception could be refined into an effective tactical tool. The irony was cruel. Just as Jack was beginning to understand how to make acoustic deception work effectively, institutional resistance was shutting down the opportunity to develop it properly. The Army's natural conservatism, which served it well in most situations, was preventing innovation that could save lives and change tactical outcomes. "Face facts, Mendelssohn," Major Thompson told him during their final interview. "Your experiments are over. You've caused enough disruption. Return to standard infantry duties and forget about your acoustic theories." That's a direct order. But Jack had one last card to play, information that could change everything if the right person would listen. On the night of December 22nd, Jack made a discovery that changed everything. While conducting unauthorized acoustic surveillance, officially banned but impossible to stop, he intercepted German communications that revealed the true scope of enemy acoustic intelligence operations. The Wehrmacht wasn't just listening passively, they were running sophisticated audio analysis programs that mapped American positions, tracked troop movements, and predicted offensive operations based on sound patterns. More critically, Jack realized the Germans were making a fundamental mistake. Their acoustic intelligence was so sophisticated that they'd become overconfident, assuming any organized sound pattern indicated genuine tactical activity. They weren't looking for deception because they believed their listening techniques were too advanced to fool. That overconfidence was their vulnerability. Jack understood now that successful acoustic deception required exploiting German sophistication, not avoiding it. Instead of creating obviously fake sounds, he needed to generate audio patterns that passed German analysis but led to incorrect tactical conclusions. The breakthrough came when Jack acquired a damaged German acoustic detection device from a captured listening post. Studying the equipment, he discovered exactly how German audio analysis worked: frequency filters, pattern recognition algorithms, tactical interpretation protocols. For the first time, he could design deceptions that would specifically fool German technology. Working in secret, technically violating Major Thompson's direct orders, Jack developed what he called the symphony of misdirection. Instead of random fake sounds, he created coordinated acoustic compositions that told coherent tactical stories. Each element was precisely calculated to trigger specific responses from German intelligence systems. The first component was movement mythology, coordinated footsteps, equipment sounds, and vehicle noises that suggested large-scale troop repositioning. But instead of random movement patterns, Jack orchestrated sounds that implied specific tactical preparations: river crossing rehearsals, urban assault training, artillery positioning for long-range bombardment. The second element was engineering fiction, tool sounds, machinery operation, and construction activity that convinced Germans that Americans were building major defensive works. Jack's patterns suggested bunker construction, tunnel excavation, and anti-tank obstacle placement, all in locations where no actual work was occurring. The masterpiece was Armor Illusion, a complex acoustic composition using modified equipment to simulate tank movements, maintenance activities, and tactical communications. Jack had learned to create convincing tank sounds using entirely non-mechanical sources: metal sheets for track noise, coordinated hammering for engine sounds, even modified radio static for armored vehicle communications. Jack's secret tests of the refined system produced immediate results. German artillery began targeting empty positions with sustained bombardments, wasting ammunition on phantom American preparations. Enemy patrols shifted focus to areas where fictional tank concentrations were supposedly massing. Most importantly, German defensive attention was drawn away from sectors where real American operations were planned. The validation came through captured German documents, intelligence reports describing major American reinforcements, and tactical preparations that existed only in Jack's acoustic compositions. German high command was making strategic decisions based on information that was entirely fictional but acoustically convincing. Lieutenant Walsh discovered Jack's unauthorized activities during a routine patrol and found himself witnessing a perfectly orchestrated deception operation. "My God," Walsh whispered, as German artillery pounded empty hillsides in response to Jack's phantom engineering sounds. "You're not just fooling their listeners, you're conducting their entire intelligence apparatus like a symphony." But the clock was ticking. Intelligence reports confirmed German offensive preparations were nearly complete. The enemy attack would come within days, possibly hours. Jack's acoustic deception had proven effective, but it remained unauthorized, unsupported, and officially prohibited. Walsh faced a career-defining decision: report Jack's violations and end the project, or risk court-martial by endorsing an unauthorized operation that was demonstrably changing German tactical behavior. "Give me one night," Jack pleaded, "one official test with proper support. I can prove this works on a scale that matters." The next 24 hours would determine whether acoustic deception became revolutionary military doctrine or remained the fantasy of a soldier who thought he could fight wars with music theory. At 0400 hours on December 23rd, German forces launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The massive offensive struck American lines with devastating force, catching Allied commanders completely off guard. Within 6 hours, entire American divisions were in retreat, communication lines were severed, and the German breakthrough threatened to split Allied forces in half. The 99th Infantry Division found itself directly in the path of the German spearhead. Colonel Harrison received orders to hold position at all costs while Allied reserves mobilized, but his unit was outnumbered 3-1 and facing elite SS Panzer divisions equipped with the latest German armor and artillery. In the chaos of retreat and regrouping, Jack's acoustic deception project was forgotten by everyone except Lieutenant Walsh. As German tanks approached their positions, Walsh made a desperate decision that would either save the division or destroy his military career. "Mendelssohn!" Walsh shouted over the sound of incoming artillery. "Your symphony of misdirection, can you make it work on a division-scale level? Right now?" Jack understood immediately. With American forces retreating in disorder, acoustic deception could create tactical advantages that conventional weapons couldn't provide. If the Germans believed they were facing stronger resistance than actually existed, they might slow their advance, buying time for Allied reinforcements to arrive. But scaling up acoustic deception from squad-level experiments to division-wide operations required resources Jack didn't have: dozens of participants, sophisticated equipment, and coordination across multiple units under combat conditions. Most critically, it required official authorization that would never come through normal channels. Walsh took the ultimate risk. Without consulting higher command, he began gathering volunteers from retreating units, telling them they were part of a Special Operations Acoustic Unit authorized by Division Intelligence. It was a complete fabrication, but desperate soldiers were willing to try anything that might slow the German advance. Working under artillery fire, Jack organized the largest acoustic deception operation ever attempted. His Division in Defense I composition required 43 participants positioned across a 3-mile front, each performing precisely timed acoustic activities that would convince German intelligence they were facing a fully prepared defensive line instead of a hastily organized retreat. The timing was impossibly tight. German advance units were already probing American positions. Panzer reconnaissance was moving through sectors that American forces had abandoned hours earlier. If Jack's deception failed, German forces would discover the weakness of American defenses and accelerate their breakthrough. Jack's plan was audacious: make the Germans think they were attacking the strongest American position in the sector instead of the weakest. Using coordinated acoustic signatures, his team would simulate artillery positions that didn't exist, tank concentrations that were fictional, and defensive preparations that were purely imaginary. The first phase began at 1100 hours. Across the entire front, Jack's volunteers initiated Fortress Symphony, coordinated sounds suggesting massive defensive works. Digging sounds implied bunker construction. Tool work suggested anti-tank obstacle placement. Radio chatter simulated command post communications for a reinforced division. German response was immediate. Instead of the rapid advance their commanders had ordered, German units began cautious probing attacks, assuming they faced prepared defensive positions. Artillery bombardments targeted areas where Jack's acoustic patterns suggested American strongpoints, wasting ammunition on empty terrain. But the deception was fragile. One mistimed sound, one participant out of position, one German patrol stumbling onto the acoustic sources, and the entire illusion would collapse. Worse, Jack was coordinating the operation while under direct fire, communicating with participants through hand signals and written notes because radio communications would reveal the deception. At 1300 hours, disaster nearly struck. A German patrol approached Sector 4, where Private Torres was creating acoustic signatures of tank maintenance. If they discovered Torres with his makeshift sound equipment, they'd realize the entire defensive line was a fabrication. Jack had 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether acoustic deception saved the American position or exposed it to complete destruction. Jack's solution was pure improvisation under fire. As the German patrol approached Torres' position, Jack initiated cascade deception, a rapid succession of acoustic misdirections designed to draw enemy attention away from the exposed volunteer. Using his portable sound equipment, Jack created the acoustic signature of American artillery spotters calling in fire missions, broadcasting the sounds toward a completely different sector. The German patrol froze, listening intently to what sounded like American forward observers coordinating a major artillery strike. Following standard Wehrmacht doctrine, they immediately withdrew to avoid the incoming bombardment that Jack had made them believe was imminent. Torres escaped detection by seconds, but Jack's improvised counter-deception created an unexpected cascade effect. German units across the entire front began taking defensive positions, convinced that American artillery was about to saturate their advanced positions. The imaginary artillery strike Jack had simulated caused real tactical delays as German commanders waited for bombardments that would never come. At 14:30 hours, the full scope of Jack's acoustic deception became apparent. German forces had slowed their advance to deal with defensive obstacles that existed only as sound patterns. Their intelligence reports described American positions of brigade strength in areas where fewer than 50 soldiers were actually present. Most critically, German tactical timing had been disrupted by responses to threats that were entirely fictional. The validation came through intercepted German radio communications. Lieutenant Walsh, monitoring enemy frequencies, heard German commanders discussing heavily fortified American positions, concentrated artillery parks, and armored reserves in defensive position. Every major tactical element they described was a product of Jack's acoustic compositions. Colonel Harrison, rallying his scattered forces, couldn't understand why the German advance had stalled. According to all tactical logic, enemy forces should have broken through American lines hours earlier. The delay was inexplicable until Lieutenant Walsh briefed him on Jack's unauthorized acoustic operation. "You're telling me one private with some volunteers and improvised sound equipment has convinced an entire German division they're attacking prepared defenses instead of broken lines?" Harrison asked incredulously. The proof was undeniable. German artillery was bombarding empty positions. Enemy infantry was advancing cautiously against non-existent strongpoints. Panzer units were maneuvering to avoid American armor that consisted entirely of coordinated metallic sounds created by soldiers with scrap metal and precise timing. By 1600 hours, American reinforcements began arriving, the 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne. But instead of finding German forces deep in American territory, they encountered enemy units still engaged in methodical attacks against phantom defensive positions. The tactical reversal was dramatic. What should have been a German breakthrough had become a grinding assault against defensive lines that were half real and half acoustic illusion. The delay caused by Jack's deception had allowed real American defenses to be established where only fictional ones had existed hours earlier. Major Thompson, arriving with the reinforcements, witnessed the impossible: German forces methodically attacking positions that his intelligence maps showed as abandoned, while Jack's volunteers continued their acoustic performance under actual combat conditions. "This is either the most brilliant tactical innovation I've ever seen," Thompson told Harrison, "or the most successful accident in military history." Jack's acoustic deception had passed the ultimate test: combat validation under maximum pressure against an experienced enemy. The technique that had been dismissed as musical fantasy had just altered the outcome of a major battle. By December 24th, the impossible had become undeniable. German forces that should have achieved breakthrough in 6 hours had been held for over 24 hours by a combination of real resistance and acoustic illusion. The delay had allowed Allied reserves to establish genuine defensive positions, transforming what should have been a German victory into a costly stalemate. Major Thompson's conversion was immediate and complete. After witnessing German artillery waste over 200 rounds on empty positions targeted through Jack's acoustic deception, he radioed division with an urgent message: "Request immediate technical analysis team. Have discovered revolutionary deception capability with immediate tactical applications." The skeptics who had dismissed Jack's musical theories were suddenly demanding detailed briefings. Captain Rogers, who had called the project foolishness, found himself trying to understand how acoustic patterns had convinced German intelligence of American defensive preparations that never existed. "Explain to me again how you made them think we had tanks where we didn't even have soldiers," Rogers asked Jack during a hastily organized tactical debrief. The question came from a man who, 48 hours earlier, had threatened court-martial for the same activities. The evidence was overwhelming and measurable. Intelligence analysis of captured German communications revealed that enemy tactical decisions were based almost entirely on information derived from Jack's acoustic compositions. German commanders had repositioned artillery, redirected infantry attacks, and allocated armor reserves based on acoustic intelligence that was systematically false. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison from Corps Intelligence arrived on Christmas morning with authorization to document and standardize Jack's techniques. "Private Mendelssohn," Morrison announced formally, "your acoustic deception methods are hereby classified as experimental tactical doctrine. You're being transferred to Special Operations Development with immediate effect." The institutional transformation was rapid. Officers who had prohibited Jack's experiments were now competing to claim credit for supporting innovation. The same bureaucratic structure that had nearly killed the project through regulations was suddenly streamlining approvals and allocating resources for expanded acoustic deception operations. But the real validation came from German prisoners captured during the stalled offensive, under interrogation. Enemy soldiers consistently described American defensive positions that matched Jack's acoustic compositions rather than actual Allied deployments. The Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had been systematically deceived by sounds that existed only in carefully orchestrated patterns. They're describing bunkers that were never built, artillery that was never positioned, and tank formations that never existed, reported Captain Davis from Intelligence. Their tactical maps show American strength as 3 times actual numbers, all based on acoustic analysis of Mendelssohn's sound patterns. The immediate military applications were staggering. If acoustic deception could delay German offensives, it could also support Allied attacks by convincing enemy forces to defend against threats that didn't exist. The technique could multiply apparent American strength, misdirect enemy resources, and create tactical advantages that conventional weapons couldn't provide. Within 72 hours, Jack was briefing generals on acoustic deception principles that had been considered impossible fantasy just days earlier. The crazy soldier with musical theories had become the Army's newest tactical innovation specialist, his techniques already being studied for implementation across multiple divisions. The transformation from ridicule to reverence was complete. But Jack understood that the real test wasn't convincing American officers. It was proving that acoustic deception could work consistently against an enemy that was already learning to adapt to this new form of warfare. By war's end, Jack Mendelssohn's acoustic deception techniques had been standardized into official Army doctrine. The Mendelssohn Protocol became required training at military intelligence schools, and acoustic deception units were deployed across multiple theaters. What began as one soldier's crazy idea had evolved into a fundamental component of modern warfare. The immediate impact was measurable. Operations using acoustic deception showed 40% fewer casualties during offensive actions and 60% greater success rates in defensive positions. German tactical planning became increasingly unreliable as their intelligence apparatus struggled to distinguish between real and fabricated acoustic signatures. By 1945, entire Wehrmacht divisions were making strategic decisions based on acoustic intelligence that American forces were systematically manipulating. Jack's innovation had proven a broader principle. The enemy's technological sophistication could become their greatest vulnerability. German acoustic intelligence was so advanced that it had become predictable, creating opportunities for exploitation that simpler systems wouldn't have offered. The more sophisticated the listening apparatus, the more systematically it could be deceived through precisely engineered false signals. The technique outlasted the war itself. During the Cold War, acoustic deception became a cornerstone of military planning, with both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces developing increasingly sophisticated audio manipulation capabilities. What Jack had improvised with scrap metal and precise timing evolved into electronic warfare systems capable of deceiving satellite surveillance and digital intelligence network. Modern military operations still employ principles Jack discovered in that frozen Belgian foxhole. Contemporary signature management techniques use electronic systems to create false acoustic, thermal, and electromagnetic signatures that mislead enemy intelligence. Stealth technology applies the same core concept, controlling how you appear to enemy sensors rather than relying solely on physical concealment. The broader lesson transcends military applications. Jack's breakthrough demonstrated that creative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when conventional approaches failed. His musical training provided analytical tools that traditional military education hadn't developed, proving that diverse perspectives could generate solutions invisible to specialized expertise. Today, acoustic deception principles are used in cybersecurity, where false digital signatures mislead automated analysis. Urban planning incorporates acoustic manipulation to control noise pollution and create desired audio environments. Even commercial marketing applies Jack's insights about pattern recognition and psychological response to acoustic stimuli. But perhaps the most significant legacy is philosophical. Jack Mendelssohn proved that impossible often means not yet understood, rather than genuinely unachievable. His story demonstrates that breakthrough innovations frequently come from combining knowledge domains that seem unrelated, in his case, music theory and military tactics. The young soldier who was told to shut up and focus on staying alive ultimately changed how wars are fought and how nations defend themselves. His acoustic compositions, designed to confuse German front lines, became the foundation for deception techniques that continue protecting democratic societies 8 decades later. Jack Mendelssohn died in 1987, having spent his post-war career developing civilian applications for acoustic engineering. His obituary in the New York Times identified him as the soldier who fought with sound, but the full scope of his contribution remained classified until the 1990s. Today, in an era of digital warfare and artificial intelligence, Jack's core insight remains relevant. The enemy's greatest strength can become their most exploitable weakness if you understand the underlying systems well enough to turn them against themselves.